Good morning. Welcome to our pre-Tisha B'Av class about the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, which is the central theme of Tisha B'Av. But there are two ways of observing this holiday. One way is to focus on the past, on the destruction, and the other way is to focus on the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash, of the Third Temple. Because the whole purpose of remembering the past is only in order to prepare us for the future. Judaism is not into wallowing in grief for things that happened in the past. When a person, God forbid, suffers a bereavement, the focus is, as King Solomon puts it, the living should take it to heart. It's a time of introspection. It's a time to focus on the meaning of life and the purpose of life and how one could go on perpetuating the life of the person who passed away so that their soul remains active in this world through our own behavior that is based on the teachings of the Torah. So the same thing is true about the destruction of the temple, which is the bereavement for all Jews. We all became mourners, and that's what Tisha B'Av is. Tisha B'Av is a day when we engage in mourning, just like a mourner would do when they lose a close relative. But the purpose is not to just grieve. The purpose is to create a foundation for the rebuilding of the Third Temple. Tisha B'Av this year starts Monday night. It ends Tuesday night. It's a 24-plus hour fast, no eating or drinking. If people have health problems, they should consult their local competent rabbi for guidance in that regard. But it's considered a very important fast. But we're praying and hoping that we won't need to fast this Tisha B'Av because all signs are pointing closer and closer to the final redemption, when we will no longer grieve and mourn on Tisha B'Av, but it will be transformed into a day of rejoicing and happiness, unprecedented joy. It'll be the greatest Jewish holiday, and that is what we really are looking forward to. But if God forbid it's delayed, then it is a fast day. It's a day when we desist from certain types of enjoyable behavior and so on. We'll talk more about it at the end of the class if you have any questions about it. But I want to continue discussing the main theme of Tisha B'Av, the loss of and the restoration of the third of the temple, the holy temple known as the Beit HaMikdash or the Beis HaMikdash. One of the things about the Beis HaMikdash was that it was the source of Jewish power and Jewish unity. This is the place where Jews from all over Israel and even from outside of Israel, although they were not obligated, the only Jews living in Israel were obligated to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and celebrate in Jerusalem 3 times a year, the 3 festive holidays of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Those are the 3 holidays the Jews were required to show up at the temple to bring their sacrifices, and all Jews were then united together as one. It's also the seat of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the supreme court of Judaism. It was the most important body of the Jewish people. It determined Jewish law and had exercised power not only over the Jewish people, the commoners, but it would exercise power over the king as well. The king was duty-bound to follow the Sanhedrin. Yes?
Rabbi, how physically would, if all Jews were required to go on the 3 holidays, how would they house or physically provide for all these people?
Okay, that's a very good question. How did they find the space for everyone to show up? It was one of the miracles. The Mishnah recounts that as one of the miracles that Jerusalem was so crowded, yet nobody complained how difficult it was to find a place to sleep. No one complained about the crowdedness of Jerusalem. What was the miracle? The miracle wasn't that it wasn't crowded. The miracle was that Jews didn't complain. And that's a real great miracle. But it was even a greater miracle. In the temple itself, people were squeezed together. I think I mentioned this last week. People were squeezed together like sardines. And when they had to bow down, everyone found enough space to bow down. That was one of the manifestations of God, that space did not occupy space. Getting back to what I was saying before, the Holy Temple was the place where all Jews united, all the hearts enmeshed with one another. And it was also the place where Jewish knowledge emanated to the rest of the world. There's a biblical verse, Ki mitzion teitzei Torah. From Zion shall Torah emerge. What is the Zion referring to? Most people think that Zion is a term used in modern times for the desire to colonize Israel. Zion is the biblical term used for Jerusalem and for the temple itself. The word Zion comes from the Hebrew word that means it's a sign. What is a sign? When you look at a sign, it tells you who's in that house. The temple tells you whose house it is, whose world it is. It was a sign for God's presence. So if you really think about it, the Beit HaMikdash was both the heart of the Jewish people. That's where all Jewish hearts converged. And it continues to be that way to this day. When we pray, where do we face? As we mentioned last week, we faced not east. In America, we faced east because that's the direction in which we go to get to Yerushalayim. But we faced Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem itself, you face the temple. And in the temple itself, you face the Holy of Holies, the place where the ark was situated. But it was also not only the heart of the Jewish people, where all Jews, all their prayers come together. What is a prayer? A prayer is an expression of your heart. So when I pray and you pray and all Jews pray, where do our prayers go? They all converge in one place, in the place where the Beit HaMikdash once stood, and it's still there. The prayers still come there, converge together, and from there they rise to heaven. So it's the heart of the Jewish people, but it's also the brain, the mind of the Jewish people, because the greatest amount of scholarship emerged from the temple. When Abraham brought his son Isaac to the Akedah, to the binding, in which he was tested to see if he would be willing to sacrifice his son, when the test was over and it was clear that that was not what God wanted, that instead he sacrificed a ram, he referred to the place, he gave it a name, Hashem Yireh, which is translated either as God will be seen or God sees. And the Talmud explains that this is the place where a Jew would come to see God and be seen by God. This was the place where you had the greatest ability to perceive godliness. You were in the presence of God in a way that you couldn't feel any other place. Now, of course, there are people who tell you they always feel God's presence. Well, if that's what you feel, that's nothing compared to how you would feel if you would be in the temple. Obviously, the greatest goal of every human being is to feel God wherever he or she is. But the temple was the place where that feeling was most pronounced. And that's why Jews would come there 3 times a year, because this would give them the appreciation for the presence of God in their lives, and it would affect them till the next holiday, and from the next holiday to the next holiday. Now, the question that many people could have is, why does God have to be limited to one place? God is all over. You can connect to God wherever you are. By definition, if you're saying that God is only in one place, you're saying that God is not in other places, and that's sacrilegious. That's against Judaism. God is all over. He fills every space, every millimeter. Every millimeter of space is filled with God's presence. The question is, to what extent is that presence felt by us? Because when God created the world, there were 2 processes that were involved. One process is to create something out of nothing. That's humanly inconceivable. We can't even conceive of the idea of something out of nothing. We could have a little something infinitesimally small and make that into something larger. You take a seed and the seed grows into a tree. But to take 0 and turn it into something, that's the greatest miracle that is even greater than miracles. But then God did another miracle. he concealed himself. That even though he is present in every inch of existence, in every millimeter, in every vestige of existence, God's presence is there. God is able to conceal himself. That we can't do that either. If I'm here, I can't be here and not be here at the same time. Yet God says, I could hide and you won't see me, even though not only I'm here, I'm animating you. I'm giving you every bit of existence. You can't separate God's energy from the person, and yet God can be hidden. Yes?
Isn't that metaphorically what every Jew does on Shabbat? That every Jew hides himself, his potential, to allow God's holiness, to allow the window
Yes.
to be in contact.
That's what Shabbat is. That's what every Jewish holiday is. It's every holiday is in terms of times when the veil is removed to some extent. And sometimes the veil is removed more than other times. The Sefer Yetzirah, one of the earliest works of Kabbalah, authored by Abraham, the patriarch Abraham, talks about existence consists of three dimensions. There's space, time, and life, and energy. So when we talk about the temple, we're talking about God's presence in terms of space. Then there's God's presence in terms of time, and then there's God's presence in terms of energy, in terms of personality. There are certain people who are living Shabbases, who are living Yom Kippurs, living Passovers. Their whole existence is so that the veil that conceals God's presence is not there, or it's much less pronounced. And the same thing is true with time, and the same thing is true with space. Now we're focusing on space. There's one place in the world, that was the Beit HaMikdash, where the veil was removed more than in any other place. Now in the first temple it was removed even more than in the second temple. Second temple was not as spiritually glorious as the first, but in the third temple, that veil will be removed completely, and that will be the place that will channel God's presence so that we'll be able to feel God's presence without the veil in any place, in any part of the world. This is the place, as I referred to before, where space, which is the physical existence, and beyond space converged. Because there are two ways in which God manifests himself. He manifests himself in the supernatural. That's what we refer to when we say God performed a miracle. God is suspending the laws of nature to one extent or another, and he's revealing himself. But then there's the way God manifests himself within nature, and those are two separate entities. The Beit HaMikdash is the place where those two entities converged, and they became one and the same. That you saw God's transcendence together with his, what philosophers refer to as immanence, the God that is vested within nature. Those two came together.
Excuse me.
Yes.
In this case, question. My father never used word synagogue or temple. He used word shul.
Right, that's the Yiddish word.
Yiddish.
Shul is, well, the word synagogue is Greek, temple is English, and shul is Yiddish.
Yes.
And Hebrew, it's a Beit Knesset, a house of gathering.
So what correct to use temple in other time?
There's nothing wrong with that word. The word is an innocent word.
Because you use, for example, you use learning center, education center.
Okay, they're different.
You don't use synagogue, you don't use temple, you use center.
That's not, has no significance whatsoever.
Okay.
And when you came to the temple, you came face to face with truth. One of the things that I think everyone recognizes, that our world is not a world of truth. Everything, and it's not just limited to the political arena, where you know when a politician opens his mouth, you know he's lying, or that he's misrepresenting the reality. They say that jokes about lawyers, and it's but it's unfair to just describe that to lawyers, because it's true about most people, that most people, when they open their mouth, they're going to say something that's either outright lie or not quite the full truth. But even if you're an honest person, and there are people who are totally honest and they would never utter a falsehood. There's this famous story of a rabbi who was known, and his followers, for being fanatical about telling the truth. And one time he was asked to come to be a character witness for a Jew who was accused of a capital crime. And he didn't know what to do, because while he believed that the Jew was innocent, how could he say the Jew was innocent when he was not a witness to what happened? And it would go against his whole philosophy of life of never compromising truth even one bit. And they used to say that if it was snowing outside, there was a blizzard, and someone walked in covered with snow, and you would ask him, is it snowing outside? You'd say, well, it was snowing a minute ago. I can't tell you about if it was snowing now, to avoid saying something that might not be 100% true. So this man was agonizing that he would have to testify to save a life, because this Jew was accused of some crazy libelous charge for which he would suffer the death penalty. But again, he said, how can I compromise the truth? And he was up all night agonizing, and in the morning he passed away. And when the judge heard about this man, he was well known even amongst non-Jews, he dropped the charges and the Jew was vindicated. So God orchestrated it that he wouldn't have to lie. It was a pretty heavy price he had to pay for it. But not being truthful doesn't mean necessarily that you're a liar. Not being truthful means that you don't see reality the way it is. And in that sense, we are all subject to a cover-up. There's a cover-up that God himself orchestrated, a cover-up that he doesn't allow us to see God's presence or to see it significantly so that it would affect our behavior. What does the temple do when a Jew entered? You came face to face with truth. You realized that you were in a place where there was nothing concealing, nothing that would compromise truth. And there's a midrash that says that when people see truth, they surrender. The reason why people don't surrender to others, I don't mean surrender in a military sense necessarily, I mean surrender to the desires of others, to the needs of others, is because you don't see reality. You don't trust everything. Someone comes, a beggar comes and says, I need some help, I have to eat. And immediately we start thinking, well, maybe the beggar is lying. Maybe the beggar doesn't really need it that badly. We are always judging people and we're always drawing conclusions because we don't see reality. If we saw reality, it would knock us down, it would knock us out, we would be overwhelmed by it, and that would change our whole being, that would instill some truth in us. Yes?
If the Jew is so worried about telling the truth, why can't he just preface his remark with the statement, I believe, and then state whatever it is?
They wouldn't have accepted that. They wanted someone to say testimony that I know the person is innocent, I know for a fact the person is innocent. But that's a story. You can't, there's a Yiddish expression, you don't ask questions on a story. Because whether the story is true or not, I think it is a true story, but we don't always know every little detail, so we can't ask questions about exactly how it happened. I would always use this as an example from my own experience. Whenever, as we were students, we had the privilege that we were able to have an audience with a Rabbi once a year around our birthday. And the whole meeting would last, in most cases, there were some exceptions, but usually it would last 2-3 minutes. Those 2-3 minutes, you felt you were in the presence, that God's presence was radiating throughout the room, and it overwhelmed you. And it changed you, and the effects lasted usually for a few weeks. You were a different person. Actually, you were started to be a different person a few weeks before, preparing for that. But then when you were in that room, you came out, you were a totally different person. And that's not something that I experienced exclusively. This is how everyone I know would have the same feeling. Why? Because just like there's a temple in physical space, it's the place in which you felt this presence of God, the presence of truth. The same thing happens in certain days. Yom Kippur, for example, especially at the end when the people say Ne'ilah, that's the closest you can get to experiencing God's presence. That's in time. The same thing is true in person. There are certain people, great holy people, whose very presence exudes this sense of truth and reality. Someone once told me, a very prominent Israeli leader, he wasn't a political leader, he was a business leader, and he had some contact with the Rabbi, and he was very close to prime ministers and presidents. He dealt with a lot of South American countries. And he wrote to the Rabbi and he asked the Rabbi, how could you be so truthful? He used the Hebrew word, emet. How could you be so emet, emes? And the Rabbi answered him. And the Rabbi said, by attaching myself to the code of Jewish law. What the Rabbi was saying is that no human being could be absolutely truthful in the total sense of the word. But if you connect yourself to something that is objectively true, like the code of Jewish law, the way it teaches us how to live our lives, in other words, doing a mitzvah, that's objectively true because it's God's commandment. And if it's God's commandment, it's inherently and intrinsically and essentially true. So if you connect yourself to objective truth, you get a taste of real truth. And that's what happened in the temple, except it was much more than just doing one mitzvah. It was a mitzvah on steroids. So that's maybe one way of putting it using modern terminology. The Beit HaMikdash was spirituality, was godliness, was truth on steroids. What is perfection? What does truth mean? Truth, the real meaning of the word truth, or emet in Hebrew, is not just the absence of a lie, but it means it's consistent, outwardly and inwardly. Because most people are different in the way they are internally and the way they are externally. Sometimes there are people who in their own individual lives don't behave the right way, but in public they do behave the right way. And it's not hypocrisy, it's just in the public you feel greater responsibility, and some people are the opposite. In public they're not very good, but privately they're very, very spiritual and very good. So we're inconsistent one way or another. There was a rabbi, the Talmud relates, who had an academy. He was the leading rabbi of his time. Rabbi Gamliel was his name. And he had a guard at the door that you cannot come into the academy unless your inside is like your outside. How did they know? So either these guards were prescient people could read people's minds, or they would say to the people, look, if you don't feel that you are totally consistent, don't waste your time coming in here because you're not going to be welcome. Whatever it is, the point is that this rabbi wanted to maintain the same standard as in the Beit HaMikdash, as in the Holy Temple, where the inside and the outside of a person became the same, one and the same. Yes?
Isn't all truth subjective, though, to interpretation?
No, there is one truth. There is one truth, and it's not subjective. It's absolute, objective truth. Then there are a lot of the versions of how people interpret the truth, and they're not necessarily all wrong. There could be several approaches to the same truth, but it's one truth. And there could be many false approaches that are false representations of truth. So the temple was a place that you didn't have any dichotomies. The physical and the spiritual were in tandem. That's another manifestation of truth. Truth is that there is consistency. The physical didn't get in the way of the spiritual, and the spiritual didn't overwhelm the physical. There's a manifestation of it. One of the laws for a Kohen who served in the temple was that he couldn't have physical blemishes. He couldn't be handicapped. Now that sounds pretty discriminating, that someone who was a left-handed person, Kohen, could not serve in the temple. You had to be right-handed, and other deficiencies. And one of the explanations for that is that the ultimate reality is that physical wholeness should be in tandem with spiritual wholeness. That's the ultimate goal in the Messianic age. There will be no disabilities, there will be no handicaps anymore. The physical will be completely healthy, consistent with the spiritual. When there's no temple, they don't work together. The Talmud tells a story of Rabbi Yehoshua. Rabbi Yehoshua used to go to Rome, and he would discuss things with the emperor in Rome, with the emperor's daughter, the princess, and she said to him one day, "Why is it that God put such a beautiful mind in such an ugly body?" He wasn't very handsome, to put it mildly. And so he said, "Where does your father keep his wine, his aged wine?" She says, "In clay barrels." She says, "Why doesn't he put it in gold barrels?" So she had it transferred to gold barrels, and the wine turned into vinegar. And when the king discovered that, he got very upset, and he called in the rabbi, and the rabbi said, it was a demonstration of sometimes beautiful wine could be put into very ugly barrels, and that's what preserves it. So that's when there's no temple, there's inconsistency. You could be ugly outwardly, and you could be beautiful within inside. But in the temple, there was no such division, there was no such inconsistency. Yes. 1 second, we have someone behind you.
In a class a long time ago, you talked about the actual temple and how it looked and how it had like different sections.
Right.
So, and different people could go into the like if you weren't a Kohen, you couldn't go into certain.
Right. Right.
So, when you were like average, ordinary person, like at what point did you feel, when you walked in? Because was it the outer walls? Was it the inner? Was it just the Kohanes? Like, when did you?
If you were tuned in, because even when the temple stood, I mentioned this the last week, God didn't take away free choice. You could stand up and say, "I am going to resist feeling anything that will take me away from my own hedonistic way of living. I want to maintain who I am and the way I have been living my life until now, and I'm not going to change." And you could resist, and you won't be affected. That's possible, but if you were open to it, you would feel it right away. Coming on the Temple Mount, you would already start feeling it, and as you get deeper and deeper inside, you would feel it more. Actually, the temple was built on many levels. There were steps going from one level to another, and those steps represented going from one level of holiness to another, to a higher level of holiness. Yes?
Yeah. Rabbi, as a physician, I know that the stronger the endorsement I give to a medication, in general, the more effective that medication will turn out to be. And any physician knows that they don't know. When they give a medication, there's a probability, but there's no truth, there's no certainty. But I know that I am helping the patient more if I make a statement to the patient, "This medicine will help you." That's a statement of certainty, as opposed to say, "Try this medicine, I think it may help."
Okay, so what's the point?
The point is that one is if I say, "This will help you," that's not a truthful statement. That's not a truthful statement. I don't know that. I'm hoping that, but I don't know that.
Okay.
But if it helps the patient more, for me to make the statement, giving it a powerful endorsement from
Okay,
me,
what does it have to do with the Beit HaMikdash?
what it has to do with is truth.
Okay, we're not gonna. You're right. That would not be a 100% truthful statement, but it would still be acceptable because we're living in an imperfect world, and sometimes not only is it permissible to not tell the truth, you're obligated to lie. Judaism considers the health of a person more important than your truthfulness. When a doctor says, "I'm going to tell the patient the truth, that you're going to die within 6 months," the patient will get a heart attack, and the relatives will get heart attacks. That's not my business. I have to tell the truth. That's evil. Telling the truth in an imperfect world is evil when it hurts people. So if you're trying to give an example where the truth is being bent because it's going to help someone, that's totally kosher. There's nothing wrong with that. But in a perfect world, that would not be necessary. Okay?
The people who were going to build the temple, did they have to, when they went to a certain level, did it all have to be Levim or Kohanim to build the actual building?
That's a good question. Yes, they would have to be. If there was no one else who can do it, then they had no choice. Even in the Holy of Holies, where the Kohen Gadol could only come once a year, if they had to repair the walls and there was no Kohen who can do it, they can hire anyone to do it. That was because it was necessary to fix it. But just one other aspect of this: when we say a blessing, what does everyone else do? When the cantor, the rabbi, whoever it is, anyone says a blessing and you hear it, what are you supposed to say? Amen. Why? Because the blessing is like expressing a spiritual energy. The word for blessing in Hebrew is baruch, baracha, which means, among other things, to draw something down from a higher level to a lower level. But it may not take root. Just because it rains doesn't mean that the earth is going to become fertile unless you cultivated the earth. Amen is your way of saying, I hope that the blessing should be concretized, that it should actually affect the world down here. It shouldn't remain up there. Sometimes blessings remain up there in the cloud, but they don't come down in the real world. So Amen is a request that it comes down in the real world. In the temple, they would not answer Amen. They would just say, Baruch Shem, blessed is the name of the glorious of the kingdom of God forever and ever. Why would they not answer Amen? Because in the temple you didn't have to answer Amen. The temple automatically concretized the spiritual energy, brought the spiritual energy into the physical world. The physical world naturally, within the temple parameters, was naturally receptive to that divine energy. You didn't have to try to concretize it. It happened on its own. When the temple was destroyed, what we lost is that introduction of such absolute truth, and that gave rise to all the evil in the world. So when we're suffering from Iran, we're suffering from Hezbollah, we're suffering from Hamas, we're suffering from crime in America, whatever it is, we have to trace it back to the destruction of the temple. So when we mourn the destruction of the temple, and many people have asked, why are we focusing on the destruction of a building when so many hundreds of thousands, millions of Jews were actually killed by the Romans in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple? And why do we focus on the building? Because it's not the building that we're focused on, it's what the building represented and what happened in that building. It brought God into the world. And as the exile ensued, God's presence was withdrawn, so that it makes it much more challenging for people to be aware of God's presence. And it's possible to have a phenomenon that a person could be an intelligent person, brilliant scientist, and to claim there is no God. That's the most ridiculous thing that anyone can possibly say. It's so childish. It's like a 2-year-old denying something that's real. And yet it's possible for brilliant scientists to come up and say there is no God, when it's the most ridiculous, the most inane thing. Why? Because the temple was destroyed, so it's possible. And when there's no God, there's no reason to be moral or ethical. So if you'll ask me, but there are many atheists who are very moral and ethical. That's because someone who did believe in God taught him or her or their parents about morality. And also we believe that there's an inner soul that we all have, and that inner soul never denies God's existence. And sometimes even if you're an atheist, you will still be in touch with that inner soul.
They're probably not an atheist to begin with.
Right, someone who once said to another person, I don't believe in God, and the other one said, I don't believe in atheists. But consciously they're denying God, and yet they can still be moral, but not because there's no God, because if there's no God, there's no reason for morality, there's no reason for anything. It's also the source of peace. Why did King Solomon build the temple? I mentioned this last week because King David lived in a time when they had to fight wars, and the temple represents the source of peace. King Solomon, the word shalom comes from the word shalom. What do you mean by peace? So the simple meaning is there was literally peace. Israel was not fighting wars with anyone. But that's only a low level of peace. Peace, ultimate peace, is when there's peace between God and the world, that the two are not in conflict with one another. And that was created by the building of the temple. And as a result, there's peace between one person and another, one Jew and another, one nation and another. And that's why it says when they I mentioned before, when they bowed, there was enough room for everyone. What was that a product of? That was a result of the fact that there was such peace, such harmony, that two bodies didn't conflict. Why do people not get along with other people? Because our interests conflict. We have different interests, and sometimes I perceive that your interests are stepping on my interests, so we get into an argument. That's because we're living in a world where there is no inherent peace. But when you were in the temple, that peace was a natural phenomenon. You felt less about your own presence and more about the other person's presence. And that's why people didn't complain in Jerusalem, because you only complain when you see that the other person is standing in your way. The famous story I told many times of this chassid who comes to his Rabbi, and he says, when in the synagogue, everyone steps on me. And the Rabbi says, because you spread yourself out and you cover every inch of the floor, they have no other place to step except on you. If you wouldn't spread out so much, if you wouldn't allow your ego to take over the whole synagogue, they wouldn't have to step on you. And here's the nicest thing, I think. Peace and truth are not allies in our world. Why? Because how do you make peace between people? You have to tell a little white lie. We call that diplomacy, by the way. What is the diplomacy? Diplomacy is to get nations to get together and not be in each other's throats. How do you do that? By lying. That's what diplomats have to do. They don't call it lying. They call it diplomacy.
Compromise.
Even Aaron, it says everyone grieved when he passed away. Why? Because he would bring peace between two people. How would he bring peace? Two people who are now enemies. He would go to one of them and tell him, I just spoke to your enemy, and he tells me he's sorry, and he really thinks very highly of you, and he would love to get back with you. And he would run to tell the other one the same story he just concocted, and when the two would meet, they would embrace. They were best friends. So the Talmud says, from this we derive that you're allowed to bend the truth in order to make peace. Peace is more important than truth. Just like health is more important than truth, sometimes you have to not tell the truth. I'm not saying doctors should always lie. I'm saying that sometimes they have to evaluate what will be better for the patient. Sometimes the patient wants to know and will be very upset if they don't know. You have to weigh all that. But you can't just automatically say, I have to tell the truth. No, health takes precedence, and peace takes precedence over truth, because they conflict. If I knew the truth about every person, what they think about me, I might not be able to be so friendly with other people if they really think about me that I'm such a horrible person. But if in the Beit HaMikdash, in the Holy Temple, truth and peace coexisted, because the division between upper and lower, between inner and outer, between spirituality and physicality disappeared. And in that case, you were able to have total unity and total peace, total truth. When God created the world, what was the purpose in creation? So how do we know? We look to the Torah. The Torah tells us. What does the Torah tell us? That God created the world because He wanted a dwelling place in the physical world. He wanted to create a reality that was distant from God, that doesn't appreciate God, that doesn't feel God's presence. God, as I mentioned before, God concealed Himself. He put a big veil on that we shouldn't recognize His presence. And through our own efforts and through the observance of the commandments and the study of Torah, we come closer and closer to appreciating God's presence, and we make this world a godly world. Where did this goal manifest itself? In the temple. the temple was a microcosm of the whole world. So whatever God wanted the whole world to appreciate, he allowed that to happen in one place, and the idea is that it should spread throughout the world. In one source, it refers to the temple. Before I mentioned the temple was the brain, where all the energy comes to the world. It's the heart. It's where all of our hearts would converge. But it's also referred to as the neck. When Joseph meets up with his brother, Benjamin, it says they fell on each other's necks and they cried. So the Midrash tells us that they were crying about the future. The temple, before it was built in Jerusalem, was built in Shiloh. That was the section of Israel that belonged to Joseph, and it was destroyed. And later on, the temple was built in Jerusalem, and the section of Israel that belonged to the tribe of Benjamin. And each one was crying for the other one's temple that would be destroyed. They were looking into the future, but why? What does it have to do with the neck? And the Talmud says that the Beit HaMikdash is compared to the neck. Why is it compared to the neck? Because though the temple is the brain and the heart, the goal of the temple is to serve the same function as the neck. A person with a brain, with nothing else, is not a full human being. But you need that the brain has a healthy connection to the rest of the body. If your brain is not connected to the rest of the body, you're not really a full-fledged human being. The purpose of the temple was not to remain in one place. That's where everyone goes. I want to get a boost of my spirituality. I go to the temple. The idea of the temple was to take the holiness there and spread it to the rest of the world, which is likened to the body. And that was the reason why when they built the temple, King Solomon's temple, the windows were not like traditional windows. Usually a window is for light. So you want a wide window to get a lot of light. The windows were very narrow, and they would get wider on the outside. So the explanation is, why would they do it that way? Because the goal of the temple was not for light. The temple didn't need light. The temple had enough spiritual light. The idea of the temple was so that the light emerges from the temple. We use windows to bring light into the room. There, the windows were intended to get the light outside of the room, to bring light to the whole world. There was no more illuminating place in the world than the Beit HaMikdash. And that's why the Rebbe explains in Maimonides, when he draws a picture of the menorah, the menorah, the Maimonides, first of all, depicts was not round, was the diagonal branches. Maimonides actually drew a picture of it. And it's based on the wording of the Torah. The Torah refers to the branches as reeds. Reeds are not round. Reeds stand up. At any rate, he also depicts the menorah had goblets. It was adorned with golden goblets. And Maimonides draws the picture of the goblets upside down. Now, no one is claiming that Maimonides was an artist. No one knows if he was or not, but there's no such claim. But why would he draw a picture of an upside-down goblet? If I gave you an assignment, I want everyone to draw a picture of a goblet, you would draw it right side up. So the Rebbe explains, because a goblet has two functions. One is to receive, and one is to pour out. Maimonides was saying the whole purpose of the temple and the menorah, which gave light, was to take that light and pour it out. The temple was there to serve the whole world, not just one place, one location. Then we get to the very controversial subject of sacrifices, and I'm not going to have enough time to do justice to the subject, but I'll focus on one aspect of it. The Hebrew word for sacrifice does not mean sacrifice. The Hebrew word is what? Shechel is the slaughterer, but what's the word for the sacrifice? Korban. Korban. What's the root of that word? Karev, get close. The idea of the korban was to get close to God, not sacrifice. But let me dwell a little bit on the concept of sacrifice. Sacrifice is something that we all do all the time. In baseball, I know a little bit about baseball. In baseball, you hit a sacrifice fly. You're out. You don't get any credit for it, but meanwhile, someone scores. So you sacrificed yourself for something more important. That's how we understand sacrifice. And sacrifice has its role in life. Sometimes we have to sacrifice a little bit of what we want for ourselves for the benefit of others. That's what the soldiers in Israel are doing. They're literally sacrificing their lives to defend the millions of Jews in Israel, and by extension, the Jews all over the world, and by extension, all of humanity. Because what happens in Israel affects all of humanity. So they're sacrificing, but that's not what the Korban is. And people who say, why would we want to kill an animal for sacrifice an animal? So if I want to be a little bit argumentative, I would say, why are you eating meat? You're sacrificing the animal for your own pleasure or health. So the answer is, well, I'm a vegetarian. I don't eat meat. He says, okay, but you killed vegetables. You murdered an apple. When you plucked that apple off the tree, you took away its life. Well, the apples don't have feelings. How do you know? Did you ever interview an apple? But you're sacrificing the apple. So let's say if we wouldn't eat vegetables and fruits, maybe we should only eat the ones that fell off the tree on their own. We probably wouldn't survive very long. So who says we have to survive? Someone I know, a chassid who had a sense of humor, went into a taxi, and the taxi driver says to him, where do you live? And he says to him, how do you know I'm living? So who says we have to live? We're assuming that my interests take precedence over the life of that vegetable, or of that fruit, or the wheat, or whatever it is. So we're all sacrificing all the time, but that's not true. We're not giving ourselves a dispensation. Yes, we shouldn't be killing animals or vegetation, but we have a dispensation. We have to live, and we have to be healthy. We have to get nutrition. No, it's not that way. The whole purpose of existence is Korban. Everything we do is intended to take something from one level and elevate it to another level. We're supposed to take, when you eat food, any food you're eating, what are you really doing? You're taking something that God created in this physical world that's not manifestly godly, and you're making it part of your own body, gives you health and strength and energy with which you do good, with which you serve God, with which you have the energy to help someone, with which you have the energy to put on tefillin or to light a Shabbos candle or whatever mitzvah you're doing. How could you do that mitzvah? You do the mitzvah through the food that you ate and the other things that we do in order to survive. So what you're essentially doing is a karev. You're taking the physical, mundane object and you're getting it closer to its intended purpose to facilitate your serving of God. Only the human being could serve God. So when you take a piece of food and you don't serve God with it, you degraded the food, then you sacrificed it. Yes, that's a sacrifice. That's not the way it should be. You shouldn't be sacrificing one thing for another. But if you do it for a higher purpose, you are actually bringing that food closer to God. Now, in the temple, they had all four levels of existence. You had inanimate, inorganic. You had salt that had to be accompanied every sacrifice, every korban. You had vegetation, you had wine, you had oil, you had flour that accompanied the offerings. You had the animal, and you had the Kohen, the human being who was responsible for making the offering. And what was he doing? An offering to God. So by that you took something inorganic, elevated it together with something vegetative and with an animal, and to the human, and from there to God. You elevated the whole world around you. Now, when we do it, we're affecting the world, our own world. It doesn't spread that far and wide. But anything they did in the temple was magnified 1,000,000,000,000-fold, so that the little action of that one offering represented the whole world. That little bit of salt that they poured on the sacrifice represented all inorganic matter in the world, in the universe. Not just the earth, the whole universe. The vegetation represented all vegetation in the universe. Now, I don't know if there is vegetation elsewhere, but most likely there is. But it elevated it, and the animal elevated all the animals. And the Kohen elevated all the humans and brought them karov, close to God, which elevated everything. So we're not sacrificing anything, we're elevating it. They tell a story of a chassid who was very poor, and he had a farbrengen, a city gathering, and they said l'chaim a few more times than they should have. And they had no more food to eat. Usually you say l'chaim and you take a little food. And they had a goat that they used to get the milk from, and that's how they supported themselves. So the farbrengen was going on, and there was no more food. So the owner of the house had the goat slaughtered, and they prepared it, and they had some meat. The next morning, the wife comes and says, well, someone stole our goat. And he said, no one stole the goat. The goat just changed its tune. Before it was saying meh, meh, and now it's saying Shema Yisrael. I don't know if his wife appreciated that. Okay, so let me just conclude with something about Tisha B'Av that has been going or circulating. Some people say, and I heard someone say it in the name of these evil people, that they're going to attack Israel on Tisha B'Av, because they know Tisha B'Av is a day when we had suffered so much destruction. The Iranians are the heirs, the descendants of Haman. The Talmud tells us that when Haman cast lots, that's what Purim means, lots, to determine which month he should kill the Jews, it was determined to be in the month of Adar. And he was very happy because that's the month in which Moses died. This is an unlucky month for Jews. Little did he know that Moses was also born in the month of Adar. Well, Tisha B'Av, they're now deciding that Tisha B'Av is a bad month for the Jews because of it's the anniversary of the destruction of the temples. Little do they know, and you promised me you're not going to tell them this, but the Talmud also says that the first Tisha B'Av, when the temple was being destroyed, the Talmud tells a story that there was an Arab who was prescient, who had certain prophetic capabilities, and he was standing next to his neighbor, the Jewish neighbor, and he heard the cow moo, probably in some unusual way. And he said, your temple has just been destroyed. This was not near Jerusalem, this was far away. And then the cow made another moo, and he says, your Moshiach was just born, which means the soul of Moshiach had come into the world with the potential of bringing about the reversal of the destruction, even at the very time the destruction was happening. So the Talmud says that Mashiach was born on Tisha B'Av. And that's one of the reasons that there's a prayer that we recite Tisha B'Av in the afternoon called Nachem, which means consolation, comfort, that even as we're still fasting and grieving over the destruction of the temple, we are filled with anticipation for the coming of Mashiach. It's the most opportune time for him to come. And it says in the Talmud, the same Talmud says that the day of your birthday is a day that you have more mazel. Your mazel, literally means your constellation. It means your spiritual energy is more healthy, is more potent. So if that's Mashiach's birthday, it means his energy is more potent on this day. And it says, the Baal Shem Tov says that every one of us has a spark of Mashiach in us. That means it's all of our birthdays in a way. That means we have more energy to bring about the reversal of Tisha B'Av than we have in any other day of the year. So our prayer is that the Iranians should discover that that was a mistake to calculate to do something on Tisha B'Av. Now, let's ideally let them not have to learn the hard way. Let them realize that you don't start up with Israel and not attack us. But in the event that they do, God forbid, we believe that we're going to see their defeat and the coming of Moshiach and the rebuilding of the Third Temple. Yes?
Plus, in this time, exactly in this time, Yeshua, your son, was born. So it's happy.
Yes, he was not on Tisha B'Av.
So congratulate your family, and usually my first toast for parents.
Okay, thank you.
So congratulations.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. He's not feeling so well, so we wish him a refuah shlema, speedy recovery. Talking about my son Yeshua, he's not here, so I could say it. One of the characteristics of the Beit HaMikdash, that the inside was like the outside. In Hasidic parlance, a person like that is called a pnimi, an inward person, someone who internalizes things that they're on the outside. Well, if I know anyone who is in that, who deserves that title, it's my son Yeshua. So I didn't want to say it in his presence because he wouldn't appreciate it.